2 Samuel chapter 3. We're going to see in this chapter some of the ramifications and the carryover of the battle that was had in chapter 2. But one of the things that I think that we need to understand as we continue to study the Old Testament, study the book of 2 Samuel, is that just because we see a character do something in Scripture, it does not mean that that was what God wanted them to do or that the way that they're acting is pleasing to God. That goes for even David, the king over Israel, the man after God's own heart, the man who God had appointed, who had anointed to lead his people. For instance, one of the things that we see in this chapter is the list of David's wives and his many children, and him getting another wife in this chapter, Michal. But when we look at Scripture, we read Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. When God is talking about rules for their future king, one of the things he says is that the king should not gather up for himself many wives. Did David know that? Did David know the book of Deuteronomy? Of course he did. He knew the Scripture, and yet we see here that he has a lot of wives, okay? And we usually think about his son Solomon. We think about a king collecting wives. Well, David was doing it too. It doesn't mean that it was something that was pleasing to God. Instead of focusing solely on how the characters are behaving in these stories and the decisions that they're making, one of the things that we really should focus on is what God is doing and how God is using these situations to glorify himself and bring about his purposes. And definitely make note, though, when the characters are being obedient to him. We see three main characters in this story: Abner, David, and Joab. Abner ends up being a peacemaker in this story. Even though he doesn't have the most pure of motivations, he's not solely seeking peace. He's just angry at Ishbosheth because he's brought this accusation against him. It doesn't even tell us whether the accusation is true or not, but you know what? Abner decides that he doesn't have to deal with it and that he's going to defect to David's side and he's going to help David unite the kingdom, which is what God had promised. We also see David acting as a peacemaker in this story. He is not seeking to further any more conflict. He's accepting of Abner when he comes over, and for his part, seems like he is trying to seek after peace. It's Joab in this particular chapter that cannot let go of his desire for revenge and ends up just making more problems when he seeks revenge and kills Abner. It's frustrating, right? When we read what happens, because we get the sense that things are beginning to resolve, that the kingdom is getting ready to come back together, and yet here is Joab giving in to his desire for revenge, putting aside peace, and deciding that what he wanted was more important. Peace is such an important thing for us, especially as followers of Christ. We know that he taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers, because they will be called sons of God." Jesus came to bring peace, and it ought to be something that is of high importance for us when we think about the people that we're in contact with on a daily basis, but especially within our church family. And if you have extra time today, I know you've already read one chapter, but I want you to go to Romans chapter 14 and read that chapter, because it's so much about us seeking peace within our church family and in a proactive way. When we think about being peacemakers, I think often we think about it in a reactive way, that if somebody does something wrong with me, that I am going to choose not to want to get revenge like Joab did. But the cool thing about Romans chapter 14 is that it teaches about being a peacemaker in a proactive way, where we are seeking not to offend our brothers and sisters or to do anything. We're on guard against causing trouble, against causing rifts. And it's so important for us to be peacemakers, because that's what Christ was. He brought the ultimate peace between us and God. So read Romans chapter 14. So many great concepts in there and things, especially we need right now when, it goes back to what Pastor Mike was preaching on Sunday. So many possibilities for division among us. And things can get messy real quick, just like this story here, and people's feelings can get hurt, and we can have trouble letting things go. But we have to seek peace proactively, putting other people before ourselves, and letting the peace that Jesus Christ won for us on the cross reign over us in our church family, in our families, and in all of our relationships. God bless you guys.